Welcome everyone to our Rethinking Value session. And I want to be apologetic for how long it took us to get this sorted at the front, but great thanks to Andrew for helping sort us out. And again, welcome to Rethinking Value. I'm JP. Our speakers are Matthew Washington and Andrew Buckwell. And we're going to begin. It looks like, Matt, are you having some trouble sharing screen?
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, just fine.
Yeah, okay, well, I've clicked on share screen, so I don't know exactly what's happened. Oh, right. Can you see that? Or
hang on. Not just yet. So perhaps what we can do is, while I sort Matt out, and since Andrew has successfully been part of the previous session, is it all right if we start with Andrew? Andrew, would you be all right with that? Take a breath. And then Matt, I'll try and do some tech support with you in the background. So Andrew, are you there?
I'm on mute, my apologies. JP, it looks like there's some sharing setting you will need to.
Okay, that's my bad. All right.
Yeah,
I'm going to need to make you co-hosts. All right, so my apologies. We're a little bit behind because of the technical issue. All right, and then Matt, okay, and then Andrew. You made me host and then it all went away, right? Okay, great.
All right,
so,
share screen. All right, final presentation. Share.
Fabulous. Rethinking value. Here we go.
Okay.
Over to you, Andrew. And if you want to say a word about, your background and how you're coming to this, it would be helpful.
Sure. Confirm everybody can see a screen with some mushrooms on it. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Andrew Buckwell. I'm a resource or environmental economist at Griffith University. I do a range of work from, say, working with cane farmers, looking at practice change and compensation schemes, climate change adaptation, particularly in the Pacific, but also for Queensland coastal councils. Thank you for coming to this session and listening to me. I'm going to, in the theme of the conference, I'm going to talk about my thing, which is valuation of ecosystem services, in terms of how it contributes to understanding our well-being, or improvements to or degradation of our well-being. As a bunch of authors pointed out in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which I guess is famous for being the original document that coined the term ecosystem services, society's natural capital, its living and non-living resources, is a key determinant of well-being. The wealth of a nation can only be evaluated in terms of considering all those capitals. So forget all of just about industrial capital, human capital, and social capital. It is foundational that we consider natural capital in terms of all of our well-being. We've got 15 minutes. I'm going to zoom through this. I'm going to talk about natural capital and ecosystem services as concepts. Some of you will be totally across this. For others, it'll be quite new. And I think by the time I get to the end of it, there'll be some chomping at the bit that are going to try and sort of pin me down on that question: is, are we just commodifying nature in order to sell it off? Which is very valid criticism, and I hope we can have some discussion afterwards. At the end of it, I'm going to address some of those critiques, but I think they'll probably be better coming out in discussion. Natural capital, ecosystem services. Natural capital is the stock of nature and the complex relationships between the components of nature, such as soils, forests, lakes, streams. All of our well-being can really be attributed as a foundation from natural capital. Interestingly, early economic theorists, I'm an economist, early economic theorists kind of saw nature as being inexhaustible, can't be degraded, It's a free input into all of our industrial and commercial activities, which is really fascinating when we compare it to, say, the talk we just heard earlier about tax reform and the massive value now associated with land. Essentially, before, early economic theorists considered it really just a free input. Ecosystem services are, I guess, the flow of goods and services into human society from which we gain benefit. We can transform those by applying our own skills, knowledge, and experience, our own human, social, and industrial capital, can transform those into give us things that provide us well-being: food, sustenance, fiber, manufactured goods, fulfillment, holidays even, and perhaps future options, which we'll talk about a little as well. But we also, when we're drawing on these services of natural capital, we need to make sure that natural capital itself can draw on its own ecosystem services to an extent that it can be maintained indefinitely into the future at a level that doesn't diminish future generations' opportunity to enjoy a similar level of services.
And I hate to interrupt you, but are we supposed to be seeing the slides advancing?
Oh, can you not see them advancing?
No, we can't. We're still on the title slide.
Okay. Can you see my screen
I know
now?
Yes, we can. All right.
All right. Let's just go with that one.
Cheers.
Where were we? So there's a few classifications of how we look at natural capital. This is a common one where we break them into provisioning services, regulating services, and cultural services. Provisioning services are the easy ones. They provision us with food, fiber, sustenance, but also in some instances, some classifications we talk about minerals as also being part of that. Regulating services are those ecological processes that provide us benefit, whether we apply capital to them or not. So one that I work in a lot is climate regulation, but also coastal protection. So we might think of a mangrove swamp as offering a regulating ecosystem service that protects assets behind that mangrove swamp. Cultural services are things we, I guess, more esoterically experience: inspiration, aesthetic value, spiritual, religious connection to land. It's a service that I guess is co-produced by both society and the environment in which we live. We also include recreation services in this classification as well. That's essentially your holidays and your ecosystem, or your ecotourism products. So within your price of a holiday, we might find buried in there the value associated with the natural environment. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit in terms of this one particular study called the Economics of the Environment and Biodiversity, possibly the world's worst acronym, TEEB, who puts the as part of an acronym. It was a study kicked off around 2007, hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme, and their framework was essentially to approach this problem in terms of recognizing values, demonstrating values, and then perhaps trying to understand how values might be captured. We'll start off with, I guess, when we come to recognize the values of natural capital ecosystem services with this total economic value framework. This makes sure we think about how we might assign a value to lots of different aspects of the environment. Just like a car or a house, in many ways, a forest, for example, has many ways that we can experience that value, and we'll all experience those values quite differently. Some might assign, say, the soil protection value of a forest much more highly than, say, its cultural value. Otherwise, someone else might experience that value quite differently. But important environmental economists like me, we consider values in terms of those that we directly use, and interestingly, those that we call them non-use values. So we actually can assign an economic value to how someone else might experience some value out of that ecosystem service or natural capital. And that's things like vicarious values. So that's literally, we gain value from someone else experiencing it, or the bequest value, which we might find value in understanding that our future generations might be able to experience that same environment. Next up, Teague looked at how we might demonstrate that value. And this is where my profession comes in terms of ecosystem service valuation, how we might assign a monetary value to those ecosystem services, not so we can commodify it, sell it off, but how we can readily compare it to other things that are normally more traded on a market. So if we're looking to make a judgment as to whether we would prefer a consumable item or whether we prefer some environmental protection, we can assign a value to both those things. One comes straight from a market value, an exchange value. We might undertake a study that reveals what that value might be in monetary terms of an environmental good or an environmental bad, so we can directly compare it to that consumable good, something that we can all recognize. For example, way back, I think this was late 80s, this was the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska, for example. Environmental economists use economic valuation techniques to assign a quite significant compensation value that was claimed against Exxon SO for this oil spill. So instead of just looking at use values, such as loss of a fishery, loss of hunting, so on and so forth, they actually surveyed the entire US population to understand how much they would value improvements into how oil ships are, I guess, the safety behind the oil ships going in and out of Prince William Sound. So that was used as a technique called stated preference survey method. So that's one amazing use of how we might use economic values for ecosystem services in a way that can, I guess, get to the true value of what nature really is in that instance. Another example, I think very pertinent at the moment, is we're in COP26, estimating the external cost of environmental bads such as carbon pollution. So environmental economists might talk, or we might hear, the social cost of carbon. This assigns a dollar value to the future damages that excess one additional ton of carbon released into the atmosphere into the future will cause. At the moment, I think the US government estimates the social cost of carbon for each additional ton to be about $30 a ton at the moment, rising to about $60 a ton in the next few years. So every ton of carbon dioxide that we emit today has a social cost. And this is just on health and assets, let alone the environment, has a social cost that's quite considerable and certainly is not met in how we manage our carbon pollution. Another way we might use economic valuation of ecosystem services is augmenting our systems of national accounts. So at the moment, as many of you know, and if you've listened to Richard Dennis this morning, our obsession with GDP as a measure of human well-being is utterly, utterly flawed, as the original authors of GDP would have agreed to themselves. However, economic valuation of ecosystem services can start generating measures such as gross ecosystem service product, where we can include how much value in monetary terms we gain each year from environmental goods and services. And then we can compound that with, say, GDP, where we can start getting to genuine progress indicators, which is, I think, the what Matt's going to talk about next. Business is already also getting into the business of valuing nature, mainly, of course, in terms of managing its own risks. We wouldn't necessarily always expect businesses to act altruistically, but their businesses typically can see either a regulatory risk, such as a future carbon tax, or reputational risk where perhaps business might be exposed to deforestation in its supply chain. Understanding what those risks might be and understanding the value of nature in terms of its input into the business can help it manage its reputation in the future. And then, of course, the obvious one is resource risk, how businesses manage inputs into its businesses, such as freshwater, timber, those kinds of things. Understanding what values ecosystem services bring to business can help businesses improve things like social license. And interesting, I've been reading quite a lot lately about how new graduates are very much attracted to businesses that take their environmental credentials very, very seriously. And lastly, in terms of demonstrating, ecosystem service valuation can help us understand what we want more of in terms of public open spaces. We can also use economic valuation techniques to understand what we might increments improvement in environmental amenity, for example. That photo you see there is actually from Budrum on the Sunshine Coast, but little pocket of rainforest, but it adds an extreme or a considerable amount of value to properties surrounding it. So improved environmental amenity can add considerable value to our economy. And finally, and this is probably the controversial part of the whole thing, it's how do we capture that value? So we know that environmental goods and services give us value. So far, we have tended to just simply consume that value without putting a price on it, without paying for it. And therefore, we're actually overusing or overextending our capacity or the capacity of that environment to regenerate. There's lots of mechanisms that talk about how we might capture some of that value back. Now, I work a lot in payment for ecosystem services schemes, whereby particularly in North Queensland, we're working with cane farmers that we're looking at what sort of compensation levels they would like for improvements in cane farming practices, or taking land out of production of cane and producing ecosystem services instead. Mainly I think we might all understand that pollution, nitrogen pollution out of the rivers in North Queensland is damaging the reef. So how much would they want to change practice from those most dangerous activities towards being safer activities? So it's compensating them for ecosystem services. A controversial one there might be what's called the RED+, which is reduction of emissions from deforestation and degradation. Generally, it's an international framework where we transfer money from the global north, generally to the global south, to try and combat deforestation. When it's well managed, where there's definitely free, informed prior consent from the communities managing those forests, most certainly it's got a good future. We're still a long way from getting towards that free, informed prior consent with those communities. And I think there's rightly criticism of it being kind of just really neocolonialism, where we're offsetting our own environmental harm to the south. So in summary, those are the connections that my work bring to trying to, I guess, make the contributions of nature to well-being just a little bit more transparent. Benefits being it's helped us in the past value customary practices, small-scale agriculture, for example, particularly in the Pacific, where it's more valuing the commons over the privatization of land, particularly for tourism ventures or new infrastructure. It helps us put a value on those customary farming practices that would otherwise be invisible to governments making those decisions. And it can also help us move beyond GDP. New Zealand is currently looking at what a well-being budget looks like. A lot of the ecosystem service measures have gone into that work there in New Zealand. And now I'll leave this slide up here just for a little moment. These are the critiques of these concepts of natural capital and ecosystem services. I take them on the chin in the sense that I agree with them. They're all very valid critiques. And what, I guess in defense, what I'd like to say is that when looking at nature in these terms, this isn't a philosophical position or a spiritual position. It's purely an instrumental position whereby if we take this framework, we can get useful information out of it in terms of valuing nature. It's not some truth, it's not a position, it's not a philosophical position. It's just useful information in which we might actually make some good decisions or better decisions about how we manage nature. And that's me.
Thank you, Andrew. And you know, everyone pop in a little, as Michelle says, daggy applause or a little heart or something. Thank you so much. And my apologies too for mispronouncing your last name.
Oh, that's all right.
So Andrew Buckwell, thank you so much for that. And I have some questions. So I'm going to invite everyone also to collect your questions. We're going to and comments. We're going to have a chat at the end. So I want to take this moment to hand over to Matt, who, in addition to his economic sensibilities, has tax expertise. So I know this is going to be fascinating for us. So over to you, Matt. And if you'd like to give a one-liner about your background as well, so people know, that would be great.
Hi. Yeah, well, I'm Matthew Washington. I originally signed in once as Matt and it's just stuck. Anyway, I have another name as well, Matthew Washington. Yeah, well, I have a master's degree with honours in philosophy, and also I have a master's degree in taxation, which involved looking at economics and financial accounting, etc. Anyway, interesting mix perhaps, but quite useful in what I ended up doing, which was looking at large corporates. Transfer pricing. In any event, it's given me a particular focus and understanding of a lot of things that go on in the corporate world. And I'm going to look at the issue of, now what I have to do is share my screen, now I did click on this before and then everything went pear-shaped and then Andrew took
You
over.
should be able to do it now. You're a co-host, so.
Yeah, good, okay. So I'll share screen and go there. Now, can you see? Oh dear, oh dear.
It's coming up. It's coming up.
Okay.
And I've now created your name in full.
Right, fine. I can't see.
Yeah, we can't see you either.
I can see myself.
Have you got to select a particular window, Matthew?
Well, all right, okay, here we go. Now, anything happening?
Yes.
There it is. Beautiful.
Right.
And
Okay,
if you want to hit the play button, then we get a full screen. Wherever that is on your presentation button.
Presentation.
Not sure. I don't know. Anyway, this will do.
I'll minimize the, as I noticed Andrew was doing, minimize the slide. Okay, so this is to do with our uses and abuses of value. I suppose it is more philosophic, but I believe pretty important aspect because it does reach into notions of economics, finance, and ethics. Okay, so I start with the first slide, which of course, well, it's some of the work of Pollitt, the cartoonist, looking at people concerned about their consumption, maybe not that concerned. And I use a vision, a coherent vision, I believe, from Herman Daly, one of the founders of ecological economics. And he notes that an economy should not be viewed as an idiot machine dedicated to maximizing waste. Its ultimate purpose is to maintain the enjoyment of life for a long time, not forever, at a sufficient level of wealth for a good, not a luxurious life. So I use this as a starting point for some of the issues that we are all facing at the moment. Okay, value has many aspects in its social role. Okay, some important analysis has been done by researchers and who've noted that in psychology and sociology, values have typically been conceptualized as shared beliefs about desired behaviors and end states. Value has been defined as relative worth, utility, and importance, degree of excellence. But these definitions highlight the fact that an object's value depends on its referential. That is to say, the area of things we are evaluating, behaviors, concepts, things, we find that important influence from the characteristics, or the qualities of those things in that group. So we invest things with value, which we all know, but we have the things with value which we've discerned, and how and why we do this is key to grasping the importance of the capacity to hold and use values. Simply, we use the expression to value to highlight an esteemed aspects or properties of things. So it'll become clear that valuing is quite a fascinating human trait. Okay, economics and finance, they claim that they're disciplines who look at the world objectively. Perhaps Andrew might want to, anyway, look at the world objectively. And of course, we're talking about the area of their reference set, the context in which we value things, where we trade, develop markets, sign agreements. This is the area in which we're talking about. We come to value certain kinds of commercial activities and their qualities. And in general speaking, what we're looking at, valued items are those where we're talking about quantities of things. But what is valued in our interpersonal dealings, what is valued in our personal lives arising from our community's collective concerns, our shared responses to broad social problems, can produce qualities, recognize themes within our interpersonal dealings, and these become values. So we recognize these quite freely or obviously because we're used to hearing about them in our daily life. Freedom, equality, tolerance, fairness, these are all abstract values which don't seem to be the same as the kind of values we quantify in economics and finance. These values are interpersonal values that arise are from generally from the substrate of our ethical values. And this is part of the terrain in part covered by what Andrew is talking about, because how do we value something that is essentially valuable, but we have to give it a price? Anyway, I don't want to get onto that. Okay, so ethical values have attained an importance as abstract values in our society and have impacts on our social, moral, and political lives. I'm going to suggest that, unfortunately, a more quantitative and narrow sense of what we value now seems to have gained the spotlight, where our future well-being, a word used during this conference quite a lot, and common good seem to be not to be part of the approved program. And I believe this is a problem. But we will find that value in these different contexts in which I've been talking about it, there is an overlap between the kind of values we see in the social world, our ethics, but also in finance and economics. Okay, but aren't economics and finance both disciplines that are value free? I mean, this is what will be generally said. Well, I'm going to suggest that price, efficiency, perfect competition, free markets, these are valued terms within the theory of economic perspective that we use. And this is generally, in our common times, the one that's used is neoclassical economics. And I suggest that these are the things that we generally value. But economics is a social science. And what we find is what we value as known as what we say these are abstract technical terms such as efficiency, equilibrium, assets, competition, etc. But these claim to be value free because they're just technical terms. However, I'm going to suggest that despite the irksome nature of some of these concepts about value to some economists who claim that it's unscientific and imprecise to value things other than in relation to price and quantification, I suggest it's what's being valued in these areas is beyond their technical role. And I'm going to suggest that neoclassical economics gives a value to some of it. There's a lot of what's going on there is ideological assumptions embedded within neoclassical economics. And this really disrupts our policy process, the public policies. Neoclassical economics, in my view, mystifies, misdirects, and damages our aims, which were originally driven by real social needs. Public policies and decisions can be overridden. Hence the ideological role, which tends to lend different aspects to the terms, which are supposedly value-free. And the power of ideology embedded in our current dominant mainstream economics is quite pervasive. And this is very, very obvious when, as soon as we start any discussions about the nature of what we should be doing, what are our plans? Okay, Dr. Patrick Curry, author of Ecological Ethics, observes that there can be no ethics without value. So I suggest values are not mere flourishes where we label our likes and dislikes as if viewing items on a supermarket shelf. Rather, our capacity to value the world, to form theories, to create myths, tell stories, and generally to form plans in cooperation with others are guided often by our values, principles, and purposes. And I suggest that these are not satisfactorily described as conditioned or explicable within the materialist conception of the world. So ethics is a process of reflection, an expression of a community's concerns, people's decisions. The world's view, which is one term, or paradigm, how we view the world, is a lot to do with what we value in a social sense. Hence, value can help us to reform our lives and laws. And I quote an Indian legal analyst, Raghananda Reddy, who I'm probably not doing justice to her name, where she says values can serve as a critique of proposed measures of lawmaking. So I'm going to suggest that ethics also are not a rigid set in stone doctrines. We can change our ethics, we can change our values, and they're not delusory acts. Again, as Patrick Curry notes, what is valued is what ultimately determines ethics in practice. So I'm really talking about axiology, which is the theory of value, but I note that I'm talking about it in a particular context to do with how the problems that we face today are so great. And these are the areas where I believe our values, particularly in terms of ethics and principles, our moral choices are going to be central to the vision that we need so our civilization moves towards something better. Going back to a bit trading on what Andrew's saying, but how on earth do we know what's more important? And this is very important. We cannot end up cashing these things out purely in a quantitative, how do we measure these things? So the mantra of endless growth, greater efficiency, free markets, policies to do with growing GDP, only growing GDP, are not substantive or worthy visions or aims, I'm suggesting. They are something hollow, and I'm suggesting valueless, not something worthy of our esteem, which is a evaluative process, right? Okay, so, and in the context of our current times, with the incredible damage we've done via the notions smuggled into neoclassical economics, the ideological aspect, these things are inimical to life. Okay, so here we have some poor perplexing board members considering what is to be valued. That's again one of the poet cartoons. But I'm going to note again from Patrick Curry, but all human societies have values and ethics. And far from being optional considerations, these are among the strongest factors that determine our actual behavior on the ground. Okay, so there's a lot of material which I can use, which I'm going to have to gloss over because I don't have that much time. But J.K. Galbraith very astutely comments how economic goals also serve vested interest in a very practical way. For if such goals take precedence, public questions can be decided according to an economic test. I'm being deliberately slightly sarcastic about this because unfortunately it's too true. These are much less complicated than other tests. A road can be cut through a park, the countryside turned over to industry, waste can be turned into the air or a lake, and a welfare measure rejected. A change in work habits commanded on a simple showing of beneficial economic effect. Now, of course, this doesn't relate back to what we're now hearing about the well-being economy, but how do we get there? Okay. Joseph Stiglitz certainly has, in his book, Price of Equality, really made it very clear how ideology has blinded a lot of people, particularly in America, to what's happened. So while suggesting that the current markets and the systemic inequity are natural, this has damaged the fabric of their society. I'm thinking of what they've just had a problem with dear Mr. Trump, enabling the cloaking of reality that disproportionate amount of economic gains and rewards go to the top 1%. And I suggest that the terms we valued in economics, which are hiding, such as price, efficiency, these are the things we're told by politicians. We must, free market, and the GDP, we must grow the GDP. These contrive to suggest that existing inequalities are somehow, economically speaking, part of a natural order. So ideology conspires to confuse and debase our values. Further, there are sociologists, which I don't have enough time to, but they also note that the spread of economists' technical tools determine the information available to policymakers, certainly in our recent times, in our finance areas in Australia, and the process of decision-making. So you end up with a very unequal situation where the prime foci of policy becomes matters which are guided by these kind of values. In pursuit of the mysterious state called equilibrium, for instance, we have a whole lot of things where the aims of the original community have been shifted to achieve some other magical state, such as equilibrium. Neoclassical economics is driven by a teleological desire to prove that capitalism is fundamentally stable. So I'm noting that this is not the case, and that was a quote from Steve Keen. He also notes that today economists empirically dismiss, now this is neoclassical economists, dismiss the notion that ideology plays any part in their thinking, but yes, it does lurk in positive economics in the core belief in equilibrium. Okay, so
Matthew, I
Yep.
hate to interrupt, but I
All
do
right.
want to leave some time for questions, and we really don't have very much
Okay.
time for that.
Okay,
So can
well,
you wrap up?
yeah, okay. Well, I certainly haven't had 15 minutes. But in any event, okay. One of the things I'm going to say is that ecocentric ethics, where the natural world is given its due as having intrinsic value, is an important element in our evaluative distinctions and can influence our actions. The other thing I'm going to note is that in actual fact, we know what to do. We already know. There are many elements in our economy already there. For instance, of course, this is the thing about responsibility, looking at a CEO considering, but in actual fact, we are responsible. CEOs don't, in fact, control our whole lives, and we can do better than that. Money is a very important element of value. Ironically, money is so useful, yet it relies on trust. People demonize money, and it can be done in various forms, and I believe better to be localized. However, it can be incredibly useful. I therefore note that it is a very good idea to watch what has happened to how money has been used to say value the value of GDP. But as Kuznets, Andrew already referred to this, he never thought that it should be valued. A nation's wealth can scarcely be inferred from the notion of national income as being and compared. And this was unfortunately commandeered by an ideological contest between the West and Russia. So what I also noticed that Phil Lawn maybe is talking on Sunday and may mention the GPI, because the GPI is much better index to value what is much more expansive. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is we have choices, the economic fantasy, which is under the current neoclassical. I also note, of course, we do have economists, heterodox economists such as Herman Daly, and a whole raft of them, some of whom I believe Andrew Buckwell will be well aware, working out of a, but they are saying something very different. I don't want to besmirch all economists, but the cooperative vision of sustainability has to look at qualitative growth. We don't have to, and this is what some of the ideas coming out of the current notion of well-being economy, we don't have to consume and, as it were, engorge the world to be turned out as goods that we don't really need. So I might end with a suggestion. Jeffrey Ingham notes that money is a deep cultural roots in a long history. Money is one of our essential social technologies. So along with writing and number. But of course, the problem is that our misadventures with money are due to poor governance. A deregulation of financial markets, as I said, we know what we did. We do know. This encouraged ilth rather than wealth. And so money's dark side can be addressed. And James K. Galbraith, the son of the former Galbraith I mentioned, also notes that in the real world, without economic regulation, there would be no long-term production chains, no stable line of credit, no trust, no supermarkets, no electrical appliance, medicines, etc. What he's saying is we do know what to do. We can reasonably define the process of economic development as an achievement of regulatory standards. This is the thing which has been demonized by neoclassical economics. You must not regulate the market. Oh no, because that would damage equilibrium, because everyone must be able to compete. To compete is our only right. Anyway, so that's really what I'm trying to say, and that in fact, money as an implicit power can be addressed. Herman Daly tells us quite clearly we can do this by introducing full reserve banking, and the other things he notes, that ultimately the purpose is to maintain the economy is ultimate purpose to maintenance and enjoyment of life for a long time, not forever, and for a sufficient level of wealth for a good and not a luxurious life. All this is achievable, I believe, under a steady state economy. Okay, enough. Went on a bit longer.
Thank you, Matthew. Everyone, applause on screen, please.
Well, it's a
So
complex
much.
area, but anyway.
Apologies for the rush, and we just I'm just aware of our time,
Cool,
and
fine.
wanted to ask for those of you who are going to have to leave in 2 minutes, you're welcome to do that. It's going to be okay for us to go a little bit over because we're bumping into tea, I've just seen, so we're not going to be running into the next session. So we can take a little extra time to have a conversation now, which I think would be brilliant. And let's see, if we don't mind, I'll start. And then we've got Anouk and Michelle who have had questions. So we'll actually bring you on screen if that's all right. To my speakers, can you stay for a little extra? Yes, Matthew and Andrew, it's okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, sure.
Okay, excellent. All right, so me first, because I have the mic.
Shares indulgence.
So for you, Andrew, I really, the point about the commodification of everything, and, you know, and you're taking on of the appropriate criticisms there. How do you see us utilizing these metrics without letting the commodification of everything run off with them?
It's possibly important to start where natural capital and ecosystem services started to be talked about in a more widespread way. And that was, I guess, when people began aware of what the implications of the Great Acceleration was, where destruction of habitat, consumable items, waste, all of those kinds of things were suddenly accelerating massively away. And that's the point that people started talking about. Actually, we need to retain a certain element of our natural capital to provide goods and services into the future. And so I guess it came from, I guess, a point of trying to do good, trying to get our heads around actually what is sustainable use of resources into a non-empty world in that instance. And so what people do with that information, of course, is a political point rather than an economic point. From an economic perspective, we try and reach, you know, Pareto efficiency or using our combination of goods and resources as effectively and efficiently as possible. Politics sorts out the direction in which we go. Politics sorts out the distribution of those goods and services, and so on and so forth. But these concepts were, if they are being co-opted, it's because economics is, you know, certainly from my perspective, I know there'll be a few people that would disagree. It's not a normative subject. It's observation, and from that point onwards, what we do, it becomes an element of political economy. So if businesses are co-opting these concepts and attempting to commodify nature, then that's a fault in our politics and our ethics, not in how we observe how people value goods and services. Now, I'm aware that that's possibly a naive conception, but where we were going was terrible. Where we are now is, you know, I guess we're the tools and capture mechanisms are accelerating away now. We've got payment for ecosystem service schemes in many parts of the world. We've got carbon taxes or carbon pricing schemes in many parts of the world. Evidently, we're still polluting the world. Carbon dioxide concentration is still rising. Emissions, maybe they're plateauing. Deforestation is still continuing. We haven't yet met that policy challenge, but the economic side of it is now at least sort of well articulated into policy, and it's a case of actually now our ethics to change political will to deal with it.
Thank you, Andrew. And that leads me right into my question for Matt. And going back, Matthew, do you prefer Matt or Matthew?
I don't mind. I'm
Okay,
used to that. I'm used to both.
well, it leads me right back to you, and going back to your slide on value versus values. And so how would you respond to what was just spoken here about the potential
Sure.
runaway commodification
Yeah.
of everything
Well,
unless we return to our values?
I have something of a problem with that. The trouble is, as I've suggested, that it's very easy for us to, and admittedly, it's neoliberalism, which is the sort of handmaiden of neoclassical economics, arguably, in terms of policy, which goes in and corrupts. So neoclassical economics is not ipso facto always trying to do the worst thing by the planet or by one another. However, it's been commandeered and by politicians to do so. However, I do think that it's not critical enough now of itself. So what I commented on the notion of which it's empirically totally false, looking at some of the work of Steve Keen, etc. But anyway, you're not necessarily defending neoclassical economics. But I would say, okay, let's consider a situation which I think is reasonable to do, of conflict. I'm going to develop, I propose to develop a marina. I am a developer, but I've got a beautiful area of the coast. I believe it will attract a lot of tourists, a lot of international tourists, maybe near the Whitsundays. I've been up there, beautiful area. And why not do this? It'll create jobs. Oh, jobs. And the dredging of the port for larger ships. Well, you've got to break some eggs to make something. Okay, so now what will one do? How does one look at these questions? Do we say, oh look, we'll protect another area and we'll allow you to do what you want to do because it will create jobs, but we'll protect another area, we'll trade off, and we'll protect this other area which previously wasn't in a marine park. And so we create another value. Oh, look, these areas are sort of equivalent, and we'll give you those. Now, I'm just saying slippery slope, slippery slope.
Slippery.
So Andrew, I realize you must have heard this before, but yeah.
Thank you very much, Matthew. If you'd care to unmute Anouk, I know you've had several questions, so you're just going to have to pick one and address it to one or both of our speakers.
Well, I guess to sum it all up, I think my last point there was in terms of the co-opting of neoclassical economics, is that not just standard game theoretic behavior? And is that not inevitable in any system we create, that all the participants simply look to use the rules of the current game to further their own interests? And how do we align the interests of the individual with the interests of everyone most effectively using this sort of model? Is it to set budgets for the planetary boundaries, for instance? Is it, how do we, as opposed to trying to convert everything to a single number, which is, I think, the real risk. So for Andrew, really, what are models to align in your view to best align the valuation of the environment with that continued long-term viability? Yeah, how do you see that working?
Well, that was one of the main challenges that environmental economics in the neoclassical framework was very much trying to address, was the imbalance between social costs and benefits and private costs and benefits. And Cecil Pigou invented his Pigouvian taxes that attempted to value the environmental cost of pollution at a production level, foist that onto the producers of that pollution in order to them to adjust their production to a socially efficient level. Socially efficient level of pollution, of course, implies that there is an acceptable level of pollution. And considering we all breathe carbon dioxide or we all consume goods and services out of the environment, that's highly likely that there is an acceptable level of pollution and extraction from the environment. When environmental economics was actually trying to close those gaps, works best, I suppose, in terms of looking at marginal analysis rather than solving the big questions of the day. So if we are to put in a pollution tax, should it be $23 a ton? Should it be $24 a ton? Should it be $28 a ton? We're talking about where those models really work, or where actually you get real leverage for on the sort of the elasticity of behavior in that sense. In terms of large questions, such as Toondah Harbour, for example, which I think we're all talking about that in code, aren't we? It's as we currently stand, of course, the mangrove flats would be valued at zero. It's simply an impediment to development. Environmental economics can actually start to assign nursery values to it. So how do fish stocks are supported by this nursery? The carbon values, particularly in the soils of the mangroves, but also the coastal protection valued by those those mangroves. Now, in many senses, they will, hazard a guess, that will come nowhere near the value assigned to developing $300 million apartments, right? So, I mean, it's starting that discussion that these things are not cost-free. But ultimately, what environmental value or economic valuation of environmental goods and services, when fed into, say, a social cost-benefit analysis, it's providing an economic view of the world that's hopefully a bit more holistic than a straight business case using numbers and only human manufactured capital in terms of benefits. It's trying to redress that balance, but ultimately it's just the economic view, and ethics, politics, political economy planning issues will ultimately decide it. Oh, you're on mute.
The human
That's
factor.
Yes.
Thank you. So I apologize, we do have to wrap up now. There's a question in the chat about whether you gentlemen would be kind enough to share your slides. That would be lovely. And so if those could be sent perhaps to Rhiannon, she will be the one to distribute them, unless they're posted somewhere and you can put that in the chat. But if not, yeah, if you could, I know I would love to study these slides at length myself. So thank you both gentlemen. Thank you everyone for showing up. Round of applause for our presenters, and thank you all for being here. Cheers.
Thank you, everybody.
Great to meet you all.
Thank
Hope to
you.
see you at our future rethinking value sessions.
Okay, great.
Cheers.
Bye.